Ladies and gentlemen, the sound you hear is a buzzsaw ripping through a painting of George Washington chopping down cherry trees. It's time for Professor Buzzkill, busting myths and taking names.
It's the agony and the ecstasy, Buzzkillers. The agony is when I bust a historical myth that you've long thought was true, but the ecstasy is when you can lord it over your friends the next day at work. The agony and the ecstasy is also the title of a famous novel published in 1961 by Irving Stone and a 1965 movie starring the famous Charlton Heston. They were both about the story of Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. There's no denying that Michelangelo's frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome are masterpieces. But did the great artist actually paint them lying on his back on a scaffold high in the air, as depicted in the novel and in the movie? Well, no, Buzzkillers. But this is one case where the truth is actually more amazing than the myth. Pope Julius II ordered Michelangelo to perform a real miracle, or in any case, to perform an artistic feat at the borderline between the possible and the impossible. The Sistine Chapel had been built between 1477 and 1480, and it was named after Pope Sixtus IV. Say that 3 times fast. Sometime in 1506, Julius thought that he wanted to have the curved ceiling of the chapel painted, and he ordered Michelangelo to take on the project. But the artist was more terrified than honored, and here's why. Julius was a tough customer, more like a military commander than a pontiff of peace, and Michelangelo was not really a painter by trade, although of course he was a great painter. He was a sculptor, and he knew little about painting frescoes. And he certainly knew nothing about painting larger-than-life frescoes on curved ceilings. In spite of Michelangelo's attempts to leave town and avoid the commission, literally, he tried to leave town, the Pope eventually had his way, as popes in those days tended to do. Michelangelo agreed to paint the ceiling and signed the contract on May 10th, 1508. He called upon some of his painter friends to help him get started, but soon realized that their methods wouldn't work for him. He was stuck in a building whose very size was meant to inspire awe, and he had to figure out a way daily to mix plaster, trowel it across the ceiling, and then paint it before it had a chance to dry. Oh, and he had to do it all on a gigantic curved ceiling above his head. Before it was all over, Michelangelo would go through a very long ordeal with very major setbacks. At one point, for instance, he discovered mold growing on one of his brand new frescoes that he just finished. He begged the Pope to let him quit the project, but Julius refused and instead sent an expert to fix the mold problem and ordering Michelangelo back to work. And what a work it was. In order to paint the ceiling, Michelangelo had to design a scaffold 60 feet above the floor with supports bolted in the walls. In fact, if you visit the Sistine Chapel today, you can see the places where the scaffold was actually attached to the walls. He suspended a cloth screen below the scaffold to cast dripping plaster and paint so that the work of the chapel, in theory, could go on while he was painting. He also caught quite a bit of plaster, dust, and paint on his face and in his beard in the 4 years it took him to do the work, 1508 to 1512. But he did not paint the Sistine Chapel while lying on his back, Buzzkillers. That would have been too easy in a way. How did he do it? Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel while standing on a plank of wood with his head and his upper body arched backwards and looking up towards the ceiling. And of course, he had to paint the whole thing with his hands above his head. And any of you who've done work like that above your head know how quickly it becomes very difficult and very painful. In his notebooks, you can even find a little picture he drew of himself painting the chapel in this way, and we've put it on the website. And he also wrote a humorous poem about his discomfort, which includes the lines, "My beard turns up to heaven, my nape falls in. Fixed upon my spine, my breastbone visibly grows like a harp. A rich embroidery bedews my face from brush drops thick and thin. In front, my skin grows loose and long. Behind, by bending it, it becomes taut and straight. Crosswise, I strain me like a Syrian bow, whence false and quaint, I know." For 4 years, he inhabited the Sistine Chapel almost full time. and ate mostly onions and stale bread to keep going. He was so overworked and stressed out before he finished the whole thing that at one point he even told his father, "I don't have any friends anymore, and I don't want any." But you've seen the Sistine Chapel Buzzkillers, or at least you've seen very good illustrations of it. Such is the cost of beauty. Talk to you next week.